Michael, like Hannah, actually, Michael is from England, and he's a big European football fan. And that doesn't mean football, that means soccer. And he has a number of hats and jerseys and other gear from a number of professional teams. This is Liverpool, in case you didn't know. But anyway, help me give a warm welcome to Michael Broadway.
Thank you, Andy. And I see some of you, I recognize from last time. I remember you. A couple of other familiar faces. So I guess you're gluttons for punishment. You've come back for more. So thank you, Andy. And thank you for showing up on this wonderful Monday morning. It's a little unusual, I guess, weather-wise. Certainly would be unusual for us in the UP to have temperatures like this. So thank you for coming, and hopefully I can provide some interesting things to talk about with respect to coffee houses. Just by way of further introduction, it's not my intention to stand at this podium and lecture to you for 90 minutes, you'll be relieved to know. There are about 60 slides in this PowerPoint, and probably after about 10, we'll stop. I'll pose a few questions, and you can also ask a few questions of me, and then we'll keep going through the slides like that. So that's the battle plan. So coffee houses. You've never seen one? There's a coffee house for you. So I have objectives. Trying to remember I'm retired now, but I do remember as a teacher, it was important to have objectives so that at the end of the presentation, you would be able to answer or understand some key ideas. And these are the objectives that I have for this presentation. And I'm not going to read them to you. I'm assuming you will be able to do that. I guess if there's one key concept we're going to talk about it, that's the concept of a third space. The concept of a third space, which I'll go into greater detail, is a sociological term. Home is the first place, work was the second place, and the third place was that place in between those two spaces. And coffee houses can function as third spaces, and we'll talk about the attributes of a third space as part of this presentation. A lot of my work was actually what we would call participant observation, just me sitting in a coffee house and observing people's behavior. And I did it for hour on hour on hour. And I went to the bathroom quite a bit. I probably didn't need that bit, but never mind. So here's an outline of the key ideas, with a little bit about even how coffee houses originated. The coffee house is the third place. The rise of gourmet coffee. We're really talking about Starbucks. However, none of the coffee houses that I studied were chain coffee houses. These are all independently owned coffee houses. The first part of this research I'm going to be reporting on is research I undertook in Portland, Oregon, back in 2016, 2017. Portland and Seattle would consider themselves to be the home of gourmet coffee in the United States. So I chose to study coffee houses in Portland because of the reputation of coffee and Portland. This concept of a place ballet in academia, researchers always like to come up with ideas, put fancy terms to them, place ballet. Essentially, that's a place where people come together and engage in activity. Now, the activity may be sitting by yourself, or it may be actually engaging in conversation. Coffee house, marketplaces, they're all examples of potential place ballets. And then we'll talk about how design can affect interaction in a coffee house. That's really the tail end of the presentation. I did some work in Minneapolis, in the uptown neighborhood of Minneapolis. And I focused on 4 specific coffee houses and showed how by designing the space inside a coffee house, you can actually affect how people behave in that space. And that gets back to, I'm a geographer, right? So what on earth am I doing studying coffee houses? Well, that's geographers study space and spatial relationships. So really all I'm doing is looking at microgeography, very small spaces, and how people behave in them. So without any further ado, yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm just curious why you call them coffee houses versus coffee shops. What's the distinction there?
That's a good question. Partly because I'm using it because when we look at the history of coffee houses, they started out as coffee houses. The first coffee houses originated in the Middle East back in the 16th century. Places like Cairo, Istanbul, they were full of coffee houses. And at the time, coffee originated in Ethiopia. I'm going a little bit off tangent here, but I'll do that. And the folks in Ethiopia and the traders in that region wanted to maintain a monopoly on coffee. And it was only in the 16th century, 17th century, that Europeans were able to smuggle coffee out of the Middle East. And the first European coffee house was in Venice. The Venetians were big traders, and they established coffee houses. But the place where coffee houses really took off was London. And I think that's probably where I should begin. There's a political scientist, philosopher by the name of Jürgen Habermas, who wrote a very famous article about the structural transformation of the public sphere. What on earth is that? Basically, he's interested in how people engaged in conversation and how people develop the idea of public opinion. And essentially, coffee houses were where people debated the affairs of the day, and public opinion was evolving or evolved. And in England, in 1675, the king tried to close down all the coffee houses because people were being openly critical of the king. They didn't want that. So this is the idea that coffee houses have been a place where people engaged in conversation. And this idea of the public sphere, where public opinion was developed. So 1700s, there were about over 1,000 coffee houses in London, and each of them had their own set of regulars. Now, we should point out they were male-dominated places. The only women that would be allowed in the coffee houses were the people to serve the coffee, but women were not part of the conversation. Some of the most famous businesses and institutions in Britain originated in coffee houses. You probably heard of Lloyd's of London. the insurers, started out in a coffee house. The Baltic Exchange, if you were ever in the shipping business, it's an institution that exists to this day. It originated in a coffee house. The Spectator magazine, which is still in existence today in 2024, originated in a coffee house. They were sometimes referred to as penny universities, places where people would actually go to become informed about as I say, the affairs of the day. There were libraries, books, magazines. Many coffee houses would produce their own newspaper, and people would come in and read it. So this whole idea is that coffee houses were places of people shared information. Now, obviously, in the 21st century, people don't go to be informed about the affairs of the day by going to a coffee house. And we'll get into, the functions of a modern coffee house in a second. Some people have argued that Habermas's ideas about the nature of coffee houses are overly romanticized. So say women were largely excluded from any debate back in the 17th century. But the key thing is that coffee houses was a place where people were engaged in face-to-face conversation. And English people, as you probably are aware, because I know there are a couple of English people here in the audience, and I guess your coordinator is English, and I'm English, so I can say this. We tend to be fairly reserved for the most part. We're not particularly outgoing as a group, but this was a coffee house, much like a pub, was a place that you could go and actually engage in conversation with a stranger, and you wouldn't be regarded skeptically, or you would. It was perfectly okay to do that, perfectly acceptable behavior. Okay, so that's the history of coffee houses. We'll get into modern coffee houses in a second. So there's a sociologist, Ray Oldenburg, published this book, 1997. And he came up with this concept of a third place. Now, here's the definition: places that host the regular, voluntary, informal, and anticipated gatherings of individuals. A convivial location between home and work that promotes social engagement. So other types of third places would be pub, suppose. Most of you look like you're old enough to watch Cheers, right? That's a perfect example of a third place. Norm came in and everybody, what did he say? Okay, well, some of you, I don't remember. Yes. Oh, that's true. Yeah, Fraser was another outgrowth of that. Anyway, not too good on modern culture. Apologies. So he goes on to describe the attributes of third places. The whole idea behind a third place is to make people at ease, and we'll get into how you make people feel at ease in terms of design, as I say later on. Has to be neutral, a neutral ground where people must be inclusive, accessible. In other words, it's got to be open a lot, can't be restricted hours. The prevailing mood has to be playful. So these are all attributes of what he considered to be a third place, a successful third place, a place for conversation. And I think late 20th century, early 20th century, there were sociologists, political scientists in the United States that were very much concerned about the decline of community and the absence of third places, or yeah, the absence of third places, I suppose. Some of this can be attributed to the way American urban life, suburban life has evolved, in which people basically get up in the morning, they get in the car, they drive to work, and they say hello to their work colleagues. And then they get back in the car and drive back home. And it's sort of a fragmented existence. The idea of walking in a neighborhood, saying hello to people, houses get bigger, there are no sidewalks. These are all concerns. And there was a very famous book written by a Harvard political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. He did a study of Milwaukee over the 60 years, and he basically documented the decline of communal life in Milwaukee. There used to be bowling leagues as a good example, hence the title Bowling Alone. And he documented how the bowling leagues had largely faded away. And we've become more and more insular, more isolated. I mean, these are the big ideas behind the third place and Putnam's Bowling Alone. And coffee houses theoretically could provide a place where people actually come together and talk to one another. Whether that's possible in today's highly charged and fragmented society or not, I don't know. But anyway, these are the ideas behind modern day coffee houses. So I talked for 15 minutes. So here's a good place to stop. So do any of you remember what the early functions of a coffee house were? Yes.
Didn't our founding fathers of this country plan out our futures in a coffee house?
Yes. Yeah, there's two famous coffee houses whose names I forget. That's one of the benefits of getting older. You forget stuff. Boston and in New York. Some of the first coffee houses in the United States were in both of those cities in pre-colonial times. They had the same attributes as you might imagine coffee houses in London. And I believe some revolutionary ideas developed in some of those coffee houses, yes. So what was functions of an early coffee house? Some of the, besides meeting, anybody else? Yes.
I just wanted to say that you mentioned that there were also pubs that filled this third space, and maybe think about or ask you about the difference about what kind of, conversations or intellectual ferment might go on in a coffee house versus a pub.
Well, I would assume the answer to that is, I guess it assumes on how much alcohol individuals consumed. But the coffee houses were a place for engagement with the ideas of the day. And perhaps alcohol would serve as a social lubricant and people would feel a little bit more playful. That's a good question. Yes. I think pubs would be more open to a wider group of people. Coffee houses would probably be the upper middle classes. And each coffee house had their own clientele that appealed to certain people. And, going back to some of those early, if you're interested in the shipping business, as I say, the Baltic Exchange is a place where it still exists today in the city of London. People who are interested in shipping and negotiating contracts to ship goods from one place to another. that's the clientele that would be there. So they were, each coffee house had their own individual group of participants, if you like, or
In your response to your fourth one there, I've read Putnam's book. And it was where we started building backyard decks instead of front porches kind of thing. And following up on that, I read another book that said a lot of the decline in communal life started when our soldiers came back from Vietnam. They were not welcomed as most soldiers have been because people were anti the war in Vietnam. And so their concept was, to heck with you then. I'll live my life, you live your life.
yeah, I don't, I mean, that's the great thing about being in this role. I can throw out questions. I don't know the answers all the time. But you've all lived long lives in this country. So what do you think? Yes.
I have two questions. One is, when I think of coffee, I think of caffeine, and you haven't mentioned that. Was that a factor in people going to coffee houses?
I don't think so.
I mean, I can understand if you were inventing a newspaper or an insurance company, it might be good to stay up for a while.
I don't think the caffeine consumption was at least in my reading research, I don't think caffeine obviously is a stimulant, but I don't necessarily think it was the reason why people would go there. They went to a coffee house, as I say, to engage in conversation with other people. And somebody that now in retirement, I have a couple of guys I have coffee with. Most of us don't even drink the whole cup, right? It's there as a prop. And so, yeah, I don't think the desire to drink a lot of caffeine was really important.
Okay, and my second question has to do with the third place.
Yeah.
I don't know much about old European history, lifestyle, but from my readings, people used to promenade. Did they speak, or was it just like walking around? I've always wondered about that.
Oh, the idea of a promenade, sort of strutting your stuff, if you like, yes. I don't think that was, to say, these were male-dominated spaces. Okay, this is where males shared their ideas. I don't think that the promenade was all that important. Yes.
And you say, this is not a question, you said, what do you think explains the decline of communal life?
Yeah.
You mentioned the backyard patio. My husband is involved in neighborhood, community development, and all the block connectors have to sit it in the front. So he knows all our neighbors, but he's the only one sitting out there. The other thing that I think explains a decline is the charter school movement. When I grew up, we all went to the same school. The parents on a block went to PTA together, so we knew the parents and children. And now on a single block, you'll have kids going to 5 different schools. So I think that is part of the explanation of a decline.
Yeah, Putnam talks about the decline of church attendance as another factor in the decline of communal life. Fewer and fewer Americans attend church, and that dates back a long, long time. And again, that would be a place where people came together. I mean, every church I've ever attended, there's always the coffee hour, right? Before or after. And if obviously people aren't attending church, then meet your neighbor or neighbors. Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering if modern coffee houses serve anywhere like the same purpose of what you were describing in the early coffee houses. Number one, a Starbucks and all that, you see so many drive-throughs. People aren't getting together for socialism there. And I don't know if any of them have that much newspapers or other pamphlets to share, and how much exchanges go on there, I guess is.
Well, stay tuned because I'll be able to tell you some of the answers to that, because that's what I did. I actually observed people's behavior. And you're also getting ahead to the future of coffee houses, because we'll talk at the end, hopefully, a little bit about Starbucks, because Starbucks is essentially getting out of the third place business and getting into the drive-through business. That's one of the impacts of COVID. They realized they could employ fewer people and they wouldn't have the overhead of maintaining that third space, providing seating, and then the associated cleanup if they just had a window. And people download the app, you order your coffee, 10, 15 minutes of when you're going to show up.
Well, what led to the rise of the modern coffee shops? I mean, is it the decline in pub attendance or something like that? Because in my mind, when I grew up, nobody went to, college, and afterwards, if you wanted to get together, you'd go to a pub, not a coffee house. What led to their emergence?
We're going to get to that. Those are all very good questions.
I suggest we let Michael proceed with
Yeah.
a few minutes before we raise any more questions.
Yeah.
And then Michael, you can reopen it when you're ready.
Okay. So this is I think this was your last question. So how do we get modern coffee houses, at least in this country? The first thing to acknowledge that throughout, coffee in America wasn't very good tasting. And particularly in the period after the Second World War, American coffee was awful. People didn't drink it, partly because of the fact that Folgers, some of the other big, Maxwell House, right? They were in a competition for market share. So basically they bought the cheapest coffee beans they could find, and coffee was pretty awful. And so Americans turned away from coffee and they turned to things like colas and juices, and coffee house consumption declined, and indeed coffee houses declined. There was a guy at MIT who did his study about coffee houses in Boston, and he showed how the number of coffee houses in the city of Boston declined from 1920 up to 1960. People just weren't going to drink coffee. Now, it all changes, or the beginnings of change occur out on the West Coast. Some of you have heard of Peet's Coffee. Okay, well, Alfred Peet was an immigrant from the Netherlands who lived in Berkeley, California, and he started roasting beans for homes sale in Berkeley, California, 1966. And then the initial founders of Starbucks, they came down to Berkeley and they decided to copy his business model, basically just roasting beans and charging people higher prices for these higher quality beans. And other things start happening in the 1980s. People become aware of the negative ecological impact about coffee plantations. And so that leads to the establishment of fair trade coffee. I'm sure some of you may be purchasing fair trade coffee. And then probably a guy who was probably Northern Michigan University's most famous graduate, Howard Schultz. Who knew? Howard Schultz was from Brooklyn, New York, but he decided to attend college in Marquette, Michigan. Who knew? And if you ever read his autobiography, Northern doesn't feature very heavily. I think there might be one paragraph in it. Anyway, he gets a degree in business, And he goes to work for Starbucks, and basically he goes around and sells coffee equipment. He's a salesman, and he travels around the Pacific Northwest and sells equipment so that people can use it to process the Starbucks beans and produce coffee, not coffee for patrons. And according to the modern legend of Howard Schultz, the early 80s, he goes to Milan, Italy, and outside the convention center, he starts wandering the streets, and he sees all these small coffee houses full of people drinking coffee and engaged in conversation. So he comes back to Seattle and he says, we should do that. We should start developing our own coffee houses. And the original founders of Starbucks say, no, we're not interested. Don't want to do it. So Schultz says, all right, I will follow my dream. And he founds his own chain. There were only ever 3. Il Giornale is the name of the coffee house he established. 2 in Seattle and 1 in Vancouver, Washington. So in the mid-1980s, Schultz opens these 3 coffee houses. Then when the original founders of Starbucks decide to get out of the business, they put it up for sale, and Schultz borrows, I think it's $8 million, and buys Starbucks. And the rest is history, right? I don't know how many Starbucks there are in the United States. I think 13,000, something like that. Essentially, he just decides to provide a place where people can go and drink Starbucks coffee. And he said, essentially, he's selling, this is the branding, I suppose. Starbucks never advertised on television or in magazines. It was always the cup and the lifestyle that they were selling to consumers. Some people attribute Starbucks' success to their turning the coffee house into this 3rd place. So, all right, a little bit of background about how space becomes a place. So we'll get a little geography here. Yifu Tuan was a geographer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He published a lot about space. So for a coffee house, how does a space become a place? How could we make this classroom more of a place and less of a space? Right? Is this room designed for social engagement? No. What could we do? Okay, Andy? You got the mic.
Yeah. Organize the tables and chairs so you're facing some other people.
Yeah, probably get rid of the tables, right?
Right.
They serve as a barrier. So the spacing of chairs, the furniture. What about the walls? Artwork, warm up the place, cushions, yes. Getting into areas that I really don't know a lot about, but I'm sure many of you can come up with how to make this a more comfortable space so people feel at ease. And so that's really what coffee houses theoretically can do, is you can transform a space into a place where people feel at ease. Another, David Seaman is a landscape architect, I guess, by training. He's a phenomenalist phenomenologist, if I can say that. He developed this idea of a place ballet, where places that are founded in habit, routine, and supportive physical environment. So I'm boring in the sense that I go to the same coffee house. Do any of you have a space that you go to, the same place? You know that I just say to the guy behind the counter, the usual. They know me, right? They know I'm just going to have a black coffee. That's all I want. And that's really a place where, you know, the coffee house that I go to would be a place where I go to talk to people, former colleagues, I suppose. So these are different, a place where people come together. And obviously, a coffee house has that potential to become this place ballet. So here we have what makes that look like this might be a comfortable place? Yes, the furniture, the cushions, lighting. Yeah. Okay, so do we really need, I think in interests of time, do you have any questions? Sometimes we can skip over questions all right. So let's talk about some very specific research I did in Portland. Portland, as I say, along with Seattle, has this rivalry for, you know, the best place for coffee. Some of you may buy Stumptown coffee. Any of you ever heard of Stumptown coffee? You probably, they obviously have a lot of business online, but they sell organic, fairly trade coffee. And again, I don't have a very sophisticated palate, whether it's drinking wine or whether it's drinking coffee. But some of the descriptions you have of coffee now are, here we have, what's this? A bright burst of citrus pairs beautifully with creamy notes of caramel and hazelnut. That goes over my head. Now, for some of you, you may be able to relate to that. I don't know. That's lady at the back. Ah, so where do you purchase your coffee from?
I buy my coffee from Intelligentsia.
Oh, in Chicago.
Yeah, well, there's 3 roasters in the United States, and one of them is in Illinois. And then I will try local coffees in Holland here.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't cut the mustard, I suppose.
Well, unless it's a Kona,
Okay.
then but Simpatico isn't bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So this is reason why I chose Portland. Okay. And here's a coffee house in Portland with all the different roasts and all the different descriptions of the flavors, the flavor notes. So anyway, you get the idea. People who are attracted to coffee are lifestyle in a cup. That's what we're selling. So what I was interested in was whether coffee houses perform this third place function. And if not, then we can probably dismiss the coffee house as a third place. So what I did was I visited 23 independently coffee houses in the city of Portland. I wasn't interested in any chains. And I was interested in the degree to which each coffee house has provided this supportive physical environment. Remember, we're talking about space and how it can be transformed into a place. So I was interested in the attributes of these coffee houses. Now, that's a map of Portland. That's the list of the various coffee houses, and they were scattered throughout the city. So they weren't just all in one neighborhood or two or three neighborhoods. They were widely dispersed throughout the city. So I was interested in how do we promote community? So did they provide a community announcement board? Was it possible for community organizations to reserve the coffee house in the evening, for a community event? Did they provide books? Did they provide a hard copy of the New York Times? Did they provide the Oregonian? This was prior to COVID. It wasn't that unusual for people to pick up a copy of a newspaper and read it, free community newspapers. Local neighborhood artists, were they able to display their work? So to what extent were these places providing this sort of sense of community? So figures in percent. So in other words, 39% of the 23 coffee houses I looked at provided a community announcement board. 17% provided books, had that sort of library function. You didn't check them out, you just picked them up. Free copy of the New York Times, 17%. Free community newspapers, nearly well over 2/3 of them did that. Nearly half of them had displayed artwork from local artists. So here's an example of a community space. So this one, I should point out, this is in the toilet. This is in the, see, that's the toilet roll. In order to really find out what was going on in the community, you had to go to the bathroom. But that was the only one that I encountered. But you'll see on this community notice board, there obviously is the month of December and individual days, basically identifying, which group was going to be in that particular space. So this is a community, right? Or at least an attempt by a coffee house to serve the local community. And of course, business, lots of people put their own business cards up there and so forth. But community, that's an example of a community notice board. If you go to franchises, you probably get into corporate policies. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm wasn't interested in looking at a corporate change. But if you're independently owned, they're probably far looser in terms of policies, what people can say and do, or post, I should say. So here's an example of a library in a coffee house, and a couple of comfy chairs, coffee for sale here, flowers. Again, this is all about providing a relaxing space to put people at ease. Another example here, this is artwork for sale in a neighborhood. No blank walls. So that's the physical space. And the next question the next question was, to what extent is there any sort of engagement going on in these spaces? So to do that, rather than try and study all 23, I selected 4 coffee houses for in-depth study, and I spent 70 hours observing what was going on in these coffee houses. And so the methodology, such as it is, was each coffee house was visited at least twice during 4 time periods: the early morning, mid-morning, lunch, and late afternoon. And again, they were located in 4 different neighborhoods. So this is just the number of hours that I did or surveyed. Weekday, 39 hours, weekend, 29 hours, and that's the distribution of time. Because as you will see, coffee houses fluctuate in terms of how that space is used or not used during the day. Why did I select the particular 4 sites? Well, part of it had to do with the ease of observation. I wanted to be able to sit and actually observe people come in, order their coffee, and see whether they left. Because you'll see in a second that the majority of coffee houses, their business is to actually to go. It's not to consume the coffee on premises. And that's particularly, well, this won't come as a surprise, I'm sure. The early morning hours, people come in to get their coffee and they fill it up and then they get back in their car and drive away. And then as far as the people who stayed, I was interested in whether they sat alone or whether they were in a group or whether they joined a group. And then I was interested in what they did. And obviously I just arbitrarily sort of did a census every hour to see what they were doing, whether they were using a device, whether it was tablet, phone, laptop, or reading a book, or even just looking out the window. So this is one of the coffee houses I studied in Portland. All right, so this is the number and percentage of persons with orders to go, weekdays versus weekends. And you can see what this is saying is that 56% of the people who came into these 4 coffee houses, they ordered drinks to go. And on the weekends, it really didn't make much difference. It was 55%. And this is just, so I observed like 1,300 orders. Now, we break it down by time period. You'll see that percentage of persons with to-go orders. So what this is saying is that between 6:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., 71% of the orders were to go. And on the weekend, 71% of the orders were to go. Alternative is, what this is saying is 29% actually came in and consumed their coffee. And if there was a time where people were going to stay, it would probably be, between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., lunch hour, if you like. Because less than 50% of the orders were to go. In terms of the size of the party, entering a coffee houses, did it vary? Well, obviously the majority of people entering a coffee houses were individuals, but on the weekends, it was more likely that people would come in as a group. And again, this difference is statistically significant. All that's saying is that weekdays and weekends are slightly different in terms of the size of party. Persons who stay in a coffee house, weekdays versus weekends. So what this is saying is that 237 people were individuals and they stayed on the weekends. It was down to 127 and so forth. Again, slightly different. On the weekends, you're more likely to see people in groups. Sitting alone, number and percent of persons sitting alone or in a group. 69% during the weekdays were sitting alone. On the weekends, it went down to like 42%. Number of persons in a group, again, obviously 31, 69, we get 100. So only 31% in groups on the weekdays, 58% weekend. So
Michael, did you make any observations about the ages of these people? Because I speculatively think they would be people mainly under 40.
Um,
Old people don't like to pay that much money for their coffee.
yeah. Well, okay, that's a very good question. Because this is in a city, okay? And Portland is full of a lot of young singles. So these are fairly uniform population. There weren't too many people with, can we say, of our age there. But we'll get to that actually in the research I did in Minneapolis. But you can see there is a difference between weekdays and weekends. So weekends are much more likely to serve that third place function where people actually go and talk, or at least in a group. This is probably too much information. It's really a busy chart, but it really is pretty straightforward. So this is the number and percentage of persons sitting alone or in a group by time period. So weekday, weekend. So 70% alone on the weekend. Oh, what are we? Where are we? Here we go. 75, even more people. So basically, early morning, individuals sitting alone. And you'll see that the percentages drop sitting alone, particularly on the weekend. You can see it down here. Oh. So this, again, all sorts of stuff going on in this picture. You got people working, you got people engaging in conversation, people waiting for orders. What were people doing? If you were weren't engaged in face-to-face conversation, 80% of people were on an electronic device, just 17% reading a book or a newspaper or magazine. Some people did knitting. I did see one person remember doing that. So what does all this mean if we go back to the idea that coffee houses are places where people engage in conversation? Well, clearly, conversation during the week is fairly rare, except during the lunch hour. So the majority of the time, people who come to a coffee house sit alone. The weekend, it changes. So the key figure would be 69% of the people during the week sit alone. And if we back up a little further, we realize that the primary function of a coffee house is to serve coffee to go. And it's not to serve as this place where people engage in conversation. Workplace function, and then its least important function, at least during the week, is this lively, scintillating, colorful, and a place where people engage in conversation. And one of the reasons why people use coffee houses as workplaces now, of course, is they provide free Wi-Fi. Okay, so before we go on and talk about Minneapolis, let's pause here, give you an opportunity to ask questions. And if you don't have any questions, I'll ask you some questions. Any questions?
Just a quick comment. In 2019, I was down in Nashville, Tennessee, stopped at a coffee house. I counted, there were 28 customers sitting around tables. What number were on the laptops? 26. 26 out of 28, you know. It was almost like a morgue, okay, because nobody was talking. And they were all centered on their laptop. And that social engagement was absent, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's not that unusual, right? this is probably a good opportunity for me to tell you about a study that I did comparing coffee houses in Seattle with Vancouver, Canada. Seattle and Vancouver are 150 miles apart. And again, I chose two yuppie neighborhoods, to put it simply. Bunch of single people in high proportion of single persons in Kitsilano, which is in Vancouver, and say Society Hill in Seattle. 15 independent coffee houses in each neighborhood, and then compare the behavior. And what do you think I found? Yes, the Canadians talked more. They went to a coffee house to engage in conversation. And there were, I always remember there's one coffee house I went to in Vancouver, sitting there drinking my coffee, and three young women came in with laptops. And the barista said to them, "The owner doesn't like people working on laptops. I suggest you leave." Now, can you imagine in the United States a business turning away customers? He didn't like people using his coffee house as a place where people worked, and so he told people to leave. Other coffee houses on the weekend would turn off the Wi-Fi. And there are coffee houses. I think one of the first coffee houses in the United States to do this was in Vermont, in Burlington, which is a, you ever been to Burlington, Vermont? It's a very sort of, I don't know, hipster, hippie place. And they proudly advertise the fact that they're Wi-Fi free. Now, it still doesn't stop people checking their phones, but again, it's the idea is to promote conversation. Yes.
I consider coffee the ultimate comfort food. I mean, the smell of it brewing is the best. I love coffee. My husband does not drink coffee, but he loves the smell of coffee brewing. One of my thoughts about coffee houses and gatherings there, it's a very easy way to speak with people without going to dinner with them or out going to lunch. Let's go get coffee. Let's do this sort of thing. And so it's kind of the first step, and you'll do that with strangers versus, I mean, we interact when we go to Starbucks, and we'll sit there, not with our laptops. And we'll strike up conversations with other couples, and it's a lot of fun where you meet people that way, which is very much what you're saying with a coffee house. The other thing that's interesting about the coffee house, I worked from home for 21 years, and I know what it's like to be isolated in a home. So there's so many people working from home now that they do seek out community and coffee houses. Now they go to the stores. That's why the laptops are up, but there is conversation. And there's business conversation going on between people, especially if you go into tech hubs like San Francisco or New York. You'll see a lot of that going on where people are gathering there. And in fact, there's some big applications. I think Craigslist was started in a coffee house. There's quite a few apps have started beyond the garages we hear about all the time too.
Question from online. Does proximity to a college affect the level of social engagement?
I guess anything I'd say would be an educated guess, because I haven't looked at that phenomenon. Another good question to ask is there a difference between rural coffee houses, in a small town, versus in a large metropolitan area? Because my research has been done in large metropolitan areas. Some sociologists have looked at McDonald's in small towns as a place where people gather to engage in conversation. Now, again, McDonald's is also getting out of the business of third places, third spaces. You know, they're restricting the size of the new McDonald's, and they just want you to order on the app and go through the drive-through. But there is research that shows that I think in rural areas, coffee houses don't necessarily perform that workplace function. They are more of a place where people gather to talk. But again, that's based more on anecdotal information and my own experience rather than any sort of definitive study. But it's a good question. Young people, obviously, I think of them and just being totally tied to a device. It's probably unfair, but I can say that to this group, right? You're not going to object.
I have a question. Was interested in your data gathering.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, why did you select those four particular coffee shops? Secondly, how did you actually record your observations? And thirdly, did you have to coordinate with the owners of these coffee shops?
I'll take the third question first. No, I didn't tell anybody what I was doing. Secondly, how did I record my observations? It's very 19th century with a pad and maybe, I don't want to say pencil, but probably a pen. How did I select the 4 sites? As I say, I visited the 23 coffee houses throughout the city to look at the structure, the physical space structure. And while I was there, I obviously wanted to get a sense of how easy it would be to sit and observe people coming in. Because again, you don't want to sit by the counter. So it was ease of observation. I wanted one entrance, one exit, so you can see. You didn't want a very large space either, because you didn't want people sneaking out if there were more than one exit. But that's really the ease of observation and just sitting there and observing people come in and just putting a stroke. It probably had something like to go or to stay, and you just tally them up at the end, to go or to stay. Yes.
I was just mentioning earlier to a couple of people that in 2019, I went on I called it my coffee shop stop tour from Holland down to Kansas City, Kansas. And it was more of an experiential trip for me to stop at every coffee shop, independently owned coffee shop that was the most popular. And I noticed that those in large cities and college towns had less of interaction when you were in there ordering your coffee and just experiencing the environment than in rural towns where people actually talk to each other more because of where they were located.
Yeah. Again, would be what I would expect. As I say, my experience is having traveled fairly extensively across the United States, and I sometimes will go to a McDonald's for coffee in the early morning. It's not that unusual to see a group of, can I say, old timers, bunch of old guys just sitting there with their coffee in front of them, talking to one another. And as I say, that phenomenon has been studied by sociologists.
I have a comment. I see some other people here. I volunteer at Refresh, which is a program for the homeless and home challenged. And we give, and mine in this church, and we give showers and social work. But I just served 95, I think, or 6. I'm looking at her. She also works at Refresh. And I looked out of the sea of the homeless people in their circles drinking their coffee. And I just realized that we are creating like a third space, you might say, for them. Makes me want to hang pictures on the wall. But yeah, you sort of enlighten me. It's and we recharge for them if they have technology, but they're all sitting around sort of like in the olden days, I guess, and having community. Isn't that kind of cool?
Yeah. Okay. I think now let's talk about, I think,
What-
Minneapolis.
One more question,
Okay.
please. How lucrative is it to own an independent coffee house?
Not very.
That's what I thought. Thanks.
No, it's not a high profit margin business. I've often thought about, well, now I'm retired, going back to Portland and seeing whether any of those 23 coffee houses that I visited are still in business. Chances are, I don't think many of them would be. I think they open up, they're good for a couple of years, and then the owner can no longer afford the losses, or just didn't turn out the way he or she hoped. So this led me, that Portland research led me to consider, a more in-depth study of how you can design a place to encourage face-to-face conversation. And for that next piece of research, I went to Minneapolis, the uptown neighborhood of Minneapolis. It's just an area about 1.5 miles south of downtown Minneapolis. It's a yuppie neighborhood, I believe. The musician Prince got his start in Uptown a long time ago. So the purpose of the second study was to examine the degree to which the design of a coffee house can put people at ease so they feel comfortable engaging in our conversation. And we hopefully recall what the attributes of a third place would be: this neutral ground, inclusive, accessible, playful mood. Put people at ease, this notion of at-homeness. So here we have an example of a coffee house in Minneapolis. They even got the roaster in the background there. This is one of the coffee. For this one, I actually had to change the name of the coffee houses, but I can tell you which ones they are when we get to the results. So, to what extent does the provision of home and office amenities influence face-to-face interaction? I focused on 4 coffee houses, and again, spent 63 hours to determine what people were doing in. And again, were they sitting alone? Were they in a group? What behaviors were they engaged in? And again, I sampled throughout the week and weekend. So this is the area of, anyway, this is the blue, the purple area, that's downtown Minneapolis. This is the area of uptown. And you can see a lot of households living alone, again, single people. So these are the 4 names of the coffee houses. I had to come up with them because I didn't think they would want their names identified. Admittedly, it was published in a social science journal, but I didn't want to face the wrath of an owner. So I changed the names, but you can see this is attributes of at-homeness. So did they have an upholstered chairs or couch, bar stools, 2 chairs and a table, 4 chairs and a table, 5 or more chairs and a table? The idea being, if you provided 5 or more chairs and a table that suggested that people were actually going to be gathered around and engaging in conversation. Whereas 2 chairs and a table, not so much. So this is the classic example of a workspace. Now, somebody's just going, okay, why do you, what explains the, why is that a workspace? What is it about the design of that suggests single tables? But you'll notice there's a chair on the opposite side. Now, what do people do with that chair?
They put their backpack on there.
That's right. They're claiming that space, right? They don't want somebody to sit opposite them. And given the size of the table, you'd probably feel uncomfortable, right? The total stranger sat opposite you. But this was Coffee House, where basically it was set up as a workspace. This is all part of a bench that ran along the entire length of the coffee house. There were outlets for people to power up their laptops underneath the bench, and people would come in, take off their coat, hang it over this chair, nice here, claim the territory, and it's a workspace. It's not a coffee house. Yes.
Yeah, talking about coffee houses here makes me think of restaurants in Texas and some of the Carolinas. There's a number of, as I recall them, they were more barbecue places. They would have large picnic tables. People would go through, pick up their different barbecue things here, and you'd sit at common tables. And that really seemed more communal. I mean, I was visiting when I was working once and sat across from one guy that was from the opposite football team, and when we had a great conversation and stuff like that. And it seemed like restaurants per se around here are not that, but down south where they have some of these outdoor, some of them are outdoor, some were indoor with these big tables and buffet line that you go to and sit to kind of fulfill this function.
Yeah, I can recall there was a movement, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago for restaurants to provide communal tables where there'd be a long table and you'd end up sitting next to a stranger. And I don't think that movement really took off. Yes.
Throughout this program, I keep thinking about how public libraries provide this. They want to provide this. These people, this poor coffee guy is never going to make a living if somebody buys 1 cup of coffee and parks there for 4 hours. And why don't they go to the public library? That's what I think.
Well, good question. All right. So at homeness, this is Minneapolis, so it gets cold there in the winter time. So do we have a fireplace? Gather around the fireplace, right? Are there potted plants? Soften the environment. Pictures on a wall. Coffee tables, that the Mountain one didn't provide that, but newspaper, yes, the Minneapolis Star Tribune. So some places provided a lot of amenities, or this one place provided a lot of amenities in contrast to this one where there was hardly any amenities at all, just a few plants. All the coffee houses provided free Wi-Fi, but some of them even provided a printer that you would connect to, and they would charge you a print. I forget how much it was, but anyway, basically 25 outlets. That's a lot of outlets for people to be working on computers. So essentially, I divided these 4 coffee houses into 2 groups. One that provided a lot of home amenities and two that didn't. And then I was interested in whether there was a difference in behavior between the two that provided the home amenities versus the two that emphasized the office amenities. And again, it's the same idea. Just look to see whether people are engaging in conversation or whether they're engaging in work. Again, this is just the percentage of weekday patrons who stayed and sat with another person by time period. And we're going to talk about, well, I will have a picture of this one. This is the one that sticks out, this one coffee house mountain. This really is the perfect third place because people are engaged in conversation the entire time, whether it's in the morning, whether it's in the afternoon, and the other places less so. Weekend patrons, you'll see that on the weekend, it's even higher percentage of people engaging in conversation. Hardly anybody goes there to work. It's a third place. This is the ideal place that Oldenburg and these other people talk about as a place where people go to engage in conversation. For people who weren't engaging in conversation, what were they doing? The usual things in the engaging with an electronic device, and you can see that the two coffee houses were emphasizing office amenities. No big surprise that more of them are working on a device versus the two coffee houses that emphasize the home amenities. And again, conversation was much higher on the weekends with the home amenities versus the office amenities. So you provide a space, a comfortable space where people feel at ease. Ideally, you're more likely to have people engage in conversation. On the other hand, if you set your coffee house up as an office space, chances are that's what people are going to do. They're just going to work. And as Debbie said, you're not going to make much money. And of course, when people are on their laptops or other device, you've no idea whether they're engaging in communicating with other people. So this coffee house, I'll give you the name of it. It's still in existence. It's called the Isles Buns Cafe. And while I was sitting in the Isles Bun Cafe, the owner came up to me. This gets back to one of the questions. And she said to me, "What are you doing?" And I told her, I said, I'm doing a study of, how people behave in coffee houses. And I just sit here and observe and blah, blah, blah. So then it became possible to learn a little bit more about the owner and the ideas behind establishing the Isles Bun Cafe. She and her husband started in the coffee house business. So this is probably over 25 years ago. They're still in existence. They survived COVID and the ups and downs of being an independently owned business. And essentially, they set out with the idea that was going to be the function of their coffee house. It was going to be a third space. And in terms of geography, they had a whole bunch of things going for them. Number one, there was a church next door where there was a daycare center. So young mothers would drop off their children at the daycare center in the morning, come for a coffee, right? Or alternatively, they would come for a coffee prior to picking up their children. Some parents would pick up their children and then bring their children into the coffee house after they picked them up. And the children grew up familiar with the coffee house. And so this was a multi-generational coffee house. You saw young people, teens, and you saw retirees. I mean, you can't, if you're just observing people, you can't make, I guess you can make educated guesses as to the age of patrons. But essentially, that's what distinguished this coffee house, was that it appealed to a wide range of people, age-wise, demographically. And it was because they set out to establish a third place. She didn't use the concept of third place, but this is the place. It has many of the at-homeness attributes. You can see pictures on the wall. The fireplace is in the corner, and it will be over to the left. You got a young person there. You've got, middle-aged. Let's see, do we have any gray-haired gentlemen? Yes. So who knows? They may be retirees. But this was a place where people would go to engage in conversation. They had large, heavy chairs, made it difficult to move, I suppose. But anyway, this is an ideal third space. And they would provide a copy of the newspaper that would be put there. And so patrons were encouraged to, if they came in by themselves and didn't want to work on their phones or look at their phones, pick up the paper and then return it. So, coffee houses as third spaces. What's happened to coffee houses? We've got about 5 minutes left since COVID. What do you think happened to coffee houses during COVID?
A lot of them went out of business, I assume.
Yes. Any other observations? Yes.
I've noticed that coffee houses don't use real mugs, or many of them do not use real mugs. That used to be an option that if you sat there, you didn't have to have a takeout cup. And my favorite coffee house in Grand Rapids now only serves in takeout. And I find the real mug much more comfortable, home-like.
Yes. And of course, that's probably a cost savings, right? They figured out it costs some. We have to hire somebody to wash the mugs, the water, hot water, whatever, the dishwasher, however they chose to clean their mugs. There's a cost savings to using just the paper disposable cup. Yes.
I would think during the COVID period, a lot of people would not have wanted the real mugs. They would have wanted the ones, styrofoam or whatever, that you can just throw away for worry of COVID.
Well, of course, how is COVID spread? It's by people, right? So the whole idea of sitting across the table from somebody, unless you were wearing a mask, was probably a little fraud.
I stopped at a coffee shop mid-Michigan, and it was an interesting concept. They had all the individual mugs hanging from hooks with the name of the person beneath it. I bet there was close to 80 cups up there. They just dedicated a whole wall to cups.
And I would guess that's a popular third place because everybody knows. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been to a coffee house. My wife and I decided about 2 weeks ago to just go out for coffee. And I was shocked at the expense. It was about what, $10 or $12 for a cup of coffee at one of these coffee houses.
But I will say, I also will occasionally go to Evergreen Commons, which is here in town, which is a place where many older people will just kind of go. And it is somewhat related to a coffee house in that you will go for a meal, which, by the way, happens to be quite cheap and should appeal to all the Dutch people in this room. But but
Gosh.
it's quite well known fact. But you get a meal and you are told that you should sit down at a table where you don't know someone. And it becomes a place for conversation. And I find as you're talking about that it really is a similar concept, and it's not exactly a coffee house, but in a way it is.
Yeah, I again, big ideas, but clearly there's all sorts of evidence that, the United States is sort of tearing itself apart, right? And how do we bring people back together? Coffee houses, theoretically, could provide a space where a neutral ground, right? Where people could come and talk to one another. So the future of coffee houses, the fastest growing coffee houses in the United States now are drive-through coffee houses. The idea that you would go to a coffee house to engage in conversation is almost, it's almost outdated. From a business perspective, it's just cheaper to put up a small kiosk, hire two people drive through, pick up their coffee and go. And Starbucks is closing down a lot of their, places that were served as third spaces at one point, and now they're going to a drive-through model. And there is one chain out in the Western United States that's the only type of coffee house they open up, drive-through. And again, that gets back to the whole idea of what's happening to community in America. So I think I'm about done. So thank you for listening. Actually a website that lists all my publications. So if you were ever interested to read the lengthy versions, I basically provide a précis in these presentations, but that's where it can be found, michaelbroadwaygeographer.com. So thank you.
I had no idea what we would hear this morning, Michael, but I found much of what you had to say interesting, and some might even say fascinating. And it also kind of pulled the curtain a little bit on how a human geographer works and how they do their research. It was kind of interesting as well. Michael will be back this afternoon talking about food tourism, how a couple of areas have focused on developing their tourist trade by conveying a sense of place with locally produced food in local restaurants. And he's comparing two places, one in Ireland and one here in Michigan. So that'll be in the afternoon. But thank you all for coming out this morning, and thanks, Michael.
Thank you.